Hi everyone, welcome back to Be Like Christ, John chapter 20, the first part of John chapter 20 today. We're almost at the end and I'm excited about it. Feels like we've been in John for a long time, but it's been a good study. I just wanted to remind everybody, if you didn't hear already, that we are going to take a break between John and Luke because I'm actually going to complete the book for Luke before doing the videos, and that way everyone will have a hard copy if they want it, and I'll have the complete set of notes before we even begin the book. And I'm going to add some additional things to the notes as we have them today for everyone's benefit, some reference material. Going to include some high-level summaries of the chapters. That way you can kind of take a look at the chapters in 5 minutes or so and get a big picture before diving into all the details. And there's been a lot of good suggestions that I've gotten from people about what would be good in a study and what I could add and make it even more valuable. So we're going to do that. There will still be some podcasts, and there will definitely be videos on the YouTube channel, probably shorter videos coming out, like a lot of the shorter stuff we've done in the past. So definitely still content, but we'll take a little bit of a break from this long-form study. So let's talk about John 20. We're talking about the resurrection today, which is good news after we talked about all the grueling details of the crucifixion in chapter 19. Also in this chapter, I'm going to do something that I've put off in the last two gospel accounts of the resurrection, and that is to go over a harmony of all four resurrection accounts. So the resurrection is recorded in all four gospels, but the details are... certain gospels record certain details, and those details are sometimes excluded from other resurrection accounts, and sometimes the order in which they're given is slightly different. As the chapter, the way that they're delivered in the chapter, I guess. And so that's led to some confusion with a lot of people, and reconciling all four of the accounts is actually not the easiest thing to do, which I found out. I thought I was going to sit down and do it, maybe in the better part of a morning, and it ended up taking me 2 days, which is part of the reason this video is delayed. But it's not the easiest thing to do, but it can be done. And I've spent a good bit of time in these notes showing you that it is possible, and I've included all the references to the things that I've found. I really didn't want to just go dig this up in somebody's commentary somewhere and regurgitate what they said. I wanted to sit down with all four gospels and try to reconcile them myself. And admittedly, there was a time I got stuck on something, couldn't figure it out, and I had to go look it up and look up what someone else had done. But made it through, and I've included that, and I've even drawn a little diagram that'll help you to understand a little bit better, hopefully. So that's all what we're talking about today. Let's now get into John chapter 20. Let's read verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. We left off in chapter 19. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, they had buried Jesus. They had to do it somewhat quickly because it was the day of preparation, the 14th of the month. And the next day, the 15th, was the Holy Convocation. It was the first day of unleavened bread. First of 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it was a Sabbath. They couldn't do any ordinary work. So they had to bury Jesus quickly and get him off the cross. And there was a tomb that was nearby, and it was Joseph's tomb, and that's where they put Jesus. And it was in a garden. So Mary Magdalene now, it's Sunday, so it's after the Sabbath day. Sabbath is past, and now they're allowed to do normal work again. So as soon as possible, Sunday morning, she goes to Jesus' tomb, and the text says that she came there to anoint Jesus. Other gospel accounts give additional information. Matthew and Mark tell us that Mary intended to bring spices to the tomb to anoint Jesus, and that there were other women who were accompanying Mary. The women came very early in the morning. Luke says that it was early dawn. Mark says that it was very early when the sun had risen. And then John says that it was early while it was still dark. And some people have tried to suggest that there's a contradiction here between John's gospel saying it was still dark and Mark's gospel saying that the sun had already risen. But anyone who's ever been up at sundown, like when my father used to take us out hunting at like 4 in the morning, okay, maybe it wasn't that early, but we would be out when the sun was coming up. And anyone who's ever been out at that time knows that even though the sun breaks the horizon, it doesn't mean that the whole world is lit up. Right? It's still dark for a while the sun gets higher in the sky, especially if you're in an area where there's hills or there's a lot of cover from trees and things like that. So the idea that it's the sun has risen, but it's still dark very early in the morning, there's nothing contradictory about that. The women arrived, and they saw that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. We know that the women were concerned about they didn't know who was going to be able to move the stone for them. Evidently, the stone was very large. Mark chapter 16, verse 4 says it was, quote, very large. And there were at least 3, probably more, women here. And sure, women aren't as strong as men for the most part, but 3 women can move a pretty big rock. But evidently, this thing was so big, not even 3 women or 4 women were going to be able to move it. So they were concerned about that, but when they showed up, they realized that the stone had already been rolled away. Now, it's not explained to us in John's gospel how that happened, but if you remember Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 28, verse 2 says, "And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it." So there was an angel that had come earlier and moved this stone away before they got there. Okay, verse 2. "So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.'" It's my understanding here, and this is a detail that's very important when it comes to harmonizing the gospel, the gospel accounts of the resurrection. It's my understanding that Mary Magdalene actually leaves the other women at this point, and she sets off in order to find Peter whether she knew John was with him or not is not clear. But so she comes to the tomb is empty, Jesus' body isn't there. She takes off, leaves the other women, she goes to find Peter, she wants to tell him what's happened. And again, this is going to be an important detail later, so don't forget it. When she found Peter and John, she told them that the body of the Lord had been taken out of the tomb. Peter and John evidently were not with the other apostles. They're somewhere else. And that actually makes sense when you remember chapter 19 and chapter 18. Because who were the 2 disciples who were specifically mentioned to have remained in Jerusalem for the crucifixion? Remember when Jesus was arrested, what happened to all the apostles? They ran away, right? Except we know Peter, he went into the courtyard of the high priest, and it was there that he denied Jesus. And we also know from chapter 19 that John was there at the cross when Jesus was being crucified. So those 2 specifically were mentioned as staying in Jerusalem during the crucifixion. So it makes sense that they were separated from the others who ran away previously. Okay? So Mary goes off and she finds them and she tells them. Verses 3 through 7. "So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going towards the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. And then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen clothes lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded up in a place by itself." As soon as Mary informs Peter and John Jesus is missing, they take off towards the tomb, and Mary follows them. John writes here that he outran Peter, and I don't know if he just included that detail because he kind of wanted to brag for all time, for all history, for everybody to read that he was faster than his friend, but that would be a detail that I would include if I beat my friend at a foot race. But no, that probably, well, I don't know. I don't know why he includes that detail. It's hard to say. I don't think he was just bragging. I think there's more to it than that, but it's kind of funny to think about. John writes that he beats Peter to the tomb, but he doesn't go into the tomb right away. He stoops and he looks in from the outside. When Peter caught up, Peter runs directly into the tomb, which is such a Peter thing to do, right? He just barges into a situation. He wants to know firsthand, right? What's going on, just like in walking on the water. But he goes right into the tomb, and Jesus wasn't there. And it's interesting the detail that John gives about the linen clothes. It says that the linen clothes that Jesus had been buried in, they were there and they were folded up. But he says then the face cloth was in another location by itself. Why he includes that detail, I'm not sure. It may just be one of those details, that he writes because that's what he saw. And it kind of adds some authenticity to the account when they include details like that. Because if you're forging a document, like strange details like that probably aren't going to be details that you include. The only reason you'd include something like that is because you specifically remember having seen it. But anyway, for whatever reason, that's what they observe. And I wanted to include this kind of application here that I found in Matthew Henry's commentary. I hardly ever read Matthew Henry because he writes just an extraordinary amount on every verse of the Bible, basically, and it becomes overwhelming. But here, I took a little glance at it, and I'm glad that I did, because I think there's an interesting observation that he has here, and I found it true in modern Christian life as well. He says, "Observe here the boldness of Peter and how God dispenses his gifts variously. John could outrun Peter, but Peter could outdare John. It is seldom true of the same persons what David poetically said about Saul and Jonathan, that they were swifter than eagles and yet stronger than lions." 2 Samuel 1:23. "Some disciples are quick, and they are useful to quicken those that are slow. Others are bold, and they are useful to embolden those that are timorous," or timid, I suppose. "Diversity of gifts, but one Spirit. John followed Peter in venturing. It should seem he durst not have gone into the sepulchre if Peter had not gone in first. Note, it is good to be emboldened in a good work by the boldness of others. The dread of difficulty and the danger will be taken off by observing the resolution and the courage of others. Perhaps John's quickness had made Peter run faster, and now Peter's boldness makes John venture further than otherwise either one of them, otherwise either the one or the other would have done. Right? So he says they're improved by the strong qualities of the other. And I don't know if that's a conclusion that John is really wanting us to draw as like a direct application of this situation, but it is a true observation of the way that Christians strengthen each other, because we all have things that we are good at and come naturally to us, or skills that we've refined over time. And then there's things that we're weak at and we're not so great at. And we can find a brother or a sister in Christ that's good in those areas, and they can make up for what we lack. And he talks about here how both were improved by the strengths of the other. And I think that's true. And a church that's really working well, and believers that are really working well, will recognize that and will take advantage of it, instead of it just being kind of like an all for one, or everyone's out on their own kind of a thing. I don't think there's any. If you've ever done any kind of work, I mean, almost anything in the church, you'll see the wisdom in what Jesus did in sending the apostles out in pairs. I think that's a lesson that is often overlooked in churches when we give duties and responsibilities out to people. So I think we would probably be wiser to give those out in pairs often, because having someone beside you is extremely helpful in emboldening you and in making up for where you lack. Verse 8 through 10. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. And then the disciples went back to their homes. After John saw Peter go into the tomb, he followed him in. John writes here that he saw and believed. Well, we know what he saw. He saw Jesus' body missing. He saw the linen cloths laying there. What was it, though, that he believed? This has kind of been a question of some debate. Verse 9, let me read that again. It says, he saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So it says he believed, but then it seems to say, but at this point they didn't understand the scriptures about him rising from the dead, if that's the way that should be interpreted. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So what is it that John believes? After seeing Jesus' body missing, it could be, let me give you a few options, it could be that John believed Mary Magdalene. She had brought him this news that Jesus was missing. Now he's seen it with his own eyes. Now he believes her. That could be it. A second option, John believed that Jesus rose from the dead, but he hadn't yet connected the Old Testament sacred scriptures of the rising of the Messiah to this particular event. That could be what it's saying. Or it could be that verse 9 should be understood when it says, for as yet they did not understand the scriptures. Maybe it should be understood, and some commentators suggested this, something to the effect of, up until now they did not understand the scriptures. Or up to this point they didn't understand the scriptures. But now John was beginning to connect the dots between what was transpiring before his eyes and what he had read in those Old Testament scriptures. Up to this point he hadn't been able to make that connection, but now he was beginning to. So it's hard to say exactly what it was that he believed. I'm not even sure that I have a favorite out of those three. I really just am not sure, and I haven't seen one knockdown argument to suggest one way or another. The different sources I looked at seem pretty divided on it, and I'm not sure I can come to a great conclusion about it. But it really seems to me, though, I guess, that when it says he believed, that in some way, whether he connected it or not to the Old Testament, in some way he believed that Jesus rose from the dead, because that's kind of the way that word is used and understood in most cases. So maybe option 2 or 3, I think, is going to be my favorite. So after observing this scene at the tomb, Peter and John, they leave, and it says that they went to their homes. All right, verse 11 through 13. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stood to look into the tomb. And she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. And they said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? And she said to them, They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. As I mentioned before, Mary Magdalene returns to the tomb with Peter and John. We don't know whether she was running or not, but maybe she beat them both. But Peter and John left after they saw what had happened, and Mary stayed. So she's the only one there at this point, it seems. And she's crying outside the tomb. And I think Mary's affection for Jesus is beautifully displayed in this scene, that she really cared about him, that yes, he was her teacher, but he was also her friend and somebody that she cared very deeply for, and she thought that he was gone. And he had been, in her mind, he had been taken from her in life, and now he had even been taken from her in death, and she's distraught about it. And that got me thinking about Mary and some of the situations that she had been in with Jesus in the past. And Jesus had wept with Mary and the other people that were mourning Lazarus' death. You remember back in John chapter 11, Lazarus was her brother, and Jesus wept with her over the sadness that was present in that scene. And now here, Mary Magdalene, she's weeping because she thinks that she's lost Jesus. And I was thinking about that, and the gospel, the good news, being united in Jesus, it creates friendships that are worthy of our tears. Deep friendships, right, that we hate to lose. But we do lose them because of death and what that does to us in separating us from one another. But one beautiful thing I think about both of these stories, both in Lazarus' case and now here in Jesus' case, is that both of these stories teach us that there's going to come a day when we'll have those friendships united again and we'll never lose them again. And there's not going to be any more weeping over lost friends. Because they both talk about the day or foreshadow the day when death is going to be swallowed up in victory and no one's going to die anymore, and we're all going to be there with the Lord, together united in friendship with God and the Spirit for all eternity. So beautiful friendships created in the gospel, and it's the only way that we can ensure the survival of those friendships in the long term, in the eternally. It's the only way. Nothing else offers that. So as Mary cried, she stooped down and she looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels sitting there. It's interesting. They didn't appear to Peter and John, but now they reappear, assuming these are the same ones that talked to the other women. And I just lost my train of thought. They ask Mary. Mary sees them, and also interestingly is that most people, when they saw angels, they kind of freaked out and fell on the ground, or they didn't know what to do, or they were afraid or something like that. Mary, there's no response of shock recorded here in John's gospel, and that may be because she was just so overwhelmed in her grief that she sees these angels and she just kind of has this dialogue with them like they're just two ordinary people. They ask her why she's crying, and she responds to them, well, it's because the body of my Lord has been taken away, and I don't know where he's gone. I don't know where they put him. Then verse 14 and 15. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." When Mary was done talking to the angels, she turned around, and Jesus was standing behind her. We don't know if he, was off somewhere and walked into this scene, or if he just kind of supernaturally appeared. But he's right behind her, and she doesn't recognize him at first. Now, that seems really odd, because Mary had been with Jesus probably, almost certainly, for years at this point. She knew him probably better than almost anybody, other than maybe his apostles. Why is it that she doesn't recognize him? Well, some people have suggested that it's just because there's probably tears in her eyes. She's overwhelmed. Maybe she doesn't take a really good look at him, because she assumes, this must just be the gardener. So it could be that reason that she doesn't recognize him, or it could be that Jesus conceals his identity from her. And you might say, well, why would he do that? I mentioned in a previous chapter that a lot of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances are different than his pre-death, the way that he appeared before his death in his ministry, when he was walking around and interacting with people on a daily basis. The way he appears after his resurrection is different. And we know that there was at least one other occasion in Luke chapter 24, verse 16, when Jesus concealed his identity from some people who knew him, some disciples, maybe even apostles. It's not 100% clear there, I don't think, but we'll just say disciples. There were some disciples of his. He concealed his identity from them. They were walking on the road to a village called Emmaus. Why he concealed his identity? Again, not 100% sure on that, but he did, and he later revealed it. So he could be doing the same thing here. Jesus, after his resurrection, is also going to kind of move around different than he did pre-death, which is why I mentioned we don't know how he got there behind Mary. Did he walk up or did he just supernaturally kind of appear? When before his death, Jesus kind of constrained himself to a lot of human mobility for the most part. Right? When he wanted to go somewhere, he walked with his disciples. When he wanted to go across the sea, most of the time he took a boat across the sea. So the way humans traveled, he also traveled in those ways. And there were exceptions to that in the Gospels, but for the most part, that's kind of the way that he acted. But now on the other side of the resurrection, one thing we're going to see is that Jesus doesn't confine himself to moving in those same ways. We're going to see Jesus kind of appear in different places, and he doesn't like come through the door of these places. He just like appears there, and it's shocking to the people that he's around. But it's just different, and we've mentioned that before. He acts different. Let's see. And so that's why I say he could have supernaturally concealed his identity from Mary, is because that is not really that unusual following the resurrection. So for whatever reason, Mary doesn't recognize him. And he asks her, he says, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She assumed that he was the gardener. Remember, John 19 told us that the tomb was in a garden, so that makes sense. And Mary asked Jesus if he had moved the body of Jesus, and I suppose he would have to reply in the affirmative. Yes, I did move the body of Jesus. But that takes us to verse 16 and through 18. Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to his disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. So when Mary didn't recognize Jesus, and then he says her name, and she recognizes him at that point. Verse 17 is another verse that's been there's been a lot of discussion about it. I want to touch on that title. She calls Jesus Rabboni, which it just means teacher. The translation is given right there in the text, but kind of like rabbi. I think we've discussed that term also. The only other person I think that uses the same term in the Gospels is Bartimaeus, who was blind, and Jesus healed him, and he called Jesus Rabboni. But anyway, verse 17, been the topic of a lot of discussion. Jesus says to Mary, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brothers and tell them that I am about to ascend to the Father." And the question is, well, why does Jesus tell Mary not to cling to him? I believe the older translations, like the King James, maybe even the New King James and ASV, they say, "Do not touch me." So why does Jesus tell Mary not to cling to him or not to touch him? Some people have suggested that Jesus, after his resurrection, was just kind of like a phantom, that he wasn't physical, he wasn't like physically resurrected. He was just kind of like almost like a spirit floating around, and he couldn't be touched. Well, that doesn't really hold any water, because in verse 27, Jesus is going to give his apostles an opportunity to touch him and the wounds that he had on him to prove that he was real. And he's also going to, I think it's in Luke's gospel, he actually eats something in front of them, which shows that he's not just a phantom. So why does Jesus tell her not to do this? Well, we already talked about her obvious affection for him. And if you had lost your friend and now all of a sudden he's standing in front of you, you would probably be tempted to run up and give him a hug or whatever they did back in those days. But to cling to them, right? Because you thought they were here in front of you and that you thought that they were gone forever. So she's obviously overwhelmed with joy. And it's not clear. I've read that the Greek construction can mean that she was either not yet clinging to him and he tells her not to do it, or that she was already clinging to him and he tells her not to cling, not to remain grasping on to him. Why? Well, I think the reason is given in the conclusion of the verse, and that is because Jesus has a task for her to complete. Rather than stay there with him, she's supposed to go and to inform his brothers that he's resurrected and that he's going to be ascending back to God. So that's the job that he gives her to do. So when he says, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, I think when he says, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, what he's saying there is he hadn't ascended to God yet. Or he wasn't going quite yet. There would still be time for Mary to love on him. That's probably not the best phrase, but I don't know what else to use. To adore him, to be with him, to see him again, to express her affections for him again. There would still be time for that. He wasn't going back to God yet. So he says, don't cling to me now. There'll be time. I'm still going to be here. I have a job for you to do. And so go tell my brothers what I've told you and what you've seen. And so she then goes and does just that. I want to end today's video with this right here, with Mary departing from Jesus and going back to the apostles. And I want to conclude then, I want to tack this onto the tail end. And that is the harmony of this story across the four Gospels. This is an interesting study and an important study because we need to be able to prove that the Bible doesn't just contradict itself all over the place with these four accounts. And there's been a lot of accusations that it does. But here I think I've come to an understanding of these events where they all make sense in the biblical text and there's no contradictions, and the story is, logically it fits together. And so what I've done is I've created an outline of the events of the resurrection across all four Gospels in order, and then I've also included in almost every case a verse reference for every time that detail is mentioned in each gospel. So if a detail is mentioned in two Gospels, I have two references there. I'm not going to say this is comprehensive. I just made this myself, and I'm not going to say there's no errors in it, but I think this is a pretty good harmony and will at least get you started in your study. And then at the end of the outline, I actually drew a little chart. And this is helpful to me trying to fit everything together in my mind. And you'll see the numbers there. Each of those little paragraphs or sentences is numbered. And so those are in sequential order for the events as they take place. And that just kind of helps you to gives you a visual for all of this outlined information up top. So let's talk about this. All the events of the resurrection put together in chronological order so that there's no contradiction. First thing, the stone is rolled away. You're going to have to read Matthew's account to read about the stone being rolled away. There's a great earthquake. There's an angel. He makes his appearance. It says his appearance is like lightning, and he has this white robe on, and he descends, and he rolls away the stone from the tomb, and then he sits on it. And then it tells us that the guards that were there, that the Jewish leaders, Jewish authorities had hired to guard the tomb, says that they feared, they trembled, and they became like dead men. And evidently at some point between the angel showing up and moving the stone and the women showing up, those guards ran away back to the Jewish leaders. Okay, so the stone has been moved. Now, the women arrive at the tomb. So Sunday morning, very early, sun just came up, it's still dark. Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb, and other women. The other Gospels tell us that some of those women were Joanna, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and, quote, other women, Luke 24, verse 10. The women are concerned about who's going to roll away the stone, and they show up, and the stone's already been rolled away. Okay? Next, Mary Magdalene departs to find Peter. So she leaves the other women. She goes off. She finds Peter. She also finds John, and she tells them about the tomb being empty. And again, as I mentioned, and this is important for the harmony bringing this all together, it seems that Peter and John are not with the other 9 apostles. Because there's 11 total, because Judas is dead. Okay, so she goes off to find them. All right, now back to the tomb. The other women are still there. What do they see as they're there? They're perplexed. They don't know what's happened. They don't know what happened to the body of Jesus. It says that they looked into the tomb, and 2 men were there in dazzling apparel. And these are the 2 angels. Mark's gospel says that there was a young man there in white apparel. And some people have tried to suggest that, this is a contradiction. Luke tells us that there were 2. Mark tells us that it only speaks about a young man in the singular. Now, is that a contradiction? It's not a contradiction. It's just that Mark chooses to focus evidently on one angel, probably the one that spoke to them, whereas Luke tells us a little bit more of the complete picture, that there was actually 2 people, or 2 angels there at that scene. But again, that doesn't have to be a contradiction, and don't buy into the fact that people are like, this is definitely a contradiction. It would be a contradiction if Mark said there was 1 angel and only 1 angel there. But he doesn't say that. He just says there was a angel, and that angel spoke to them. Okay, let's see. So the angels that were in the tomb, they knew what the women were looking for. And they asked the women why they were seeking the living among the dead. Why are you looking for Jesus where dead people are? Jesus isn't dead anymore. And they remind the women of what Jesus had said when he said the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again. Luke chapter 24, verse 7. It says that the women remembered those words, and the angel told the women to go back to the disciples. This would be the other 9, or just the other disciples. We don't know the exact number. Go back to them and tell them what you've seen. Okay? So those other women who remained at the tomb, they now leave. They're headed back to wherever those other disciples are. We don't know their exact location. On the chart down below, I just assumed that they were in Bethany because they had spent some time there in the past. Don't know that for sure, but they're somewhere else, right? And so the angels tell these women, they say, go and tell those disciples that Jesus has resurrected and that Jesus was going to meet them in Galilee. All right, so those women leave the tomb, and now Peter and John, having heard the message that Mary has brought, they are running to the tomb. So they run there, and Mary returns with them, and John beats Peter to the tomb, but Peter then gets there and he runs right into the tomb, and then they observe the linen clothes that were lying there folded up, and the face cloth that was lying there folded up in another place, and they see everything, and then what do? Just like we talked about, they went on back to their homes. But Mary remains there. Mary stood outside weeping, and she looks into the tomb then, and she sees the 2 angels that are sitting there where Jesus' body had been. It says one at the head and one at the feet, John 20, verse 12. And the angels ask Mary why she's weeping. And Mary responds. She says, they've taken away Jesus, and I don't know where they've taken him to. Mary then turns around. She sees Jesus. She doesn't recognize him. And then Jesus says her name, and then she finally recognizes him. He says, "Don't cling to me. Go tell my brothers what you've seen, and that I am going to be ascending back to my Father." Okay. That's where kind of John's story ends, but there's more when you go over to the Gospel of Matthew, because in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus then makes another appearance to those other women who are on their way back to tell the disciples about the angels at the tomb, right? So if you're not confused, hopefully you're not confused, but those other women, they're still on their journey back. Jesus now makes an appearance to them as they're journeying back to tell the apostles. That's Matthew chapter 28, verse 9. The women, see Jesus, they fall at his feet and they worship him, and Jesus instructs them again. He says, "Okay, now go complete the job that you were given to do. Go tell the apostles what you've seen and that I've resurrected." And so the women then return to the apostles and they tell them that they've seen the Lord, and they've seen him. Then, probably sometime after that, Mary Magdalene shows up to the apostles, and she tells them that she has also seen the Lord and that he's resurrected. And then Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, both tell us that the apostles did not believe the testimony of either Mary Magdalene or the other women. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I really think the diagram will help, but getting the notes in this chapter and to understand this harmony is probably going to be a lot more helpful than just hearing me talk through all of that. And on the chart, you'll notice I did make two assumptions. We don't know the exact locations of Peter and John or the rest of the apostles. So my assumptions were that I just put Peter and John in Jerusalem because they had been there for the crucifixion. Maybe they, remained there. Maybe they were. We don't know. We just know that they were somewhere other than where the other apostles were. And so I put them in Jerusalem, and then I put the other apostles over in Bethany. And you'll be able to see and follow the sequence 1 through 11 to how all of these events played out, and hopefully that will be beneficial to you. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. Or if you find any details that maybe I looked over didn't quite get accurate, at least in your mind, I'd be interested in knowing, because again, it's not the easiest harmony to make, but I think this is solid. I don't see any problems with it. So let me know. All right. We will cover, probably in a short video, the rest of John chapter 20 in the next video, and we're going to do John chapter 21 in one shot, because I'm ready to be done. But thanks everybody for your attention. I'll talk to you guys next time.